going to recognize that, but to recognize the right of that state to have dispossessed them. Now, of course, they're not going to accept that, nor should they. There is no such thing in international affairs, and the effort to try to attain it is pointless and absurd. Let me now make clear that while the PLO has, with varying degrees of ambiguity, but often with great precision, I should say, called for a political settlement with, along the lines I mentioned, Israel and the United States have been equally clear, namely in rejecting any such political settlement. The United States and Israel reject any, not only do they reject the right of the Palestinians to self-determination, they reject any manifestation of that right. In fact, U.S.-Israeli rejectionism is so extreme that the United States and Israel will not even permit the Palestinians to select their own representatives for eventual negotiations. That's really extreme. If somebody had come along in 1947 and said the Jews in Palestine can be represented, but not by the Zionists, we would have called that a regression to Nazism, correctly, and the same principle holds here. The fact that the PLO has engaged in terror, as have all, to my knowledge, other nationalist movements, including George Washington, obviously not to the point. By those standards, we would have rejected the Zionist movement, which engaged in extreme terror. In fact, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, was the head of one of the leading terrorist groups, the group that assassinated the UN ambassador Pope Bernadotte, among many other atrocities, and was the author in 1947 of a pamphlet in which he not only advocated terror, but said that there is no moral barrier whatsoever to the use of terror, nor can there be. Well, yeah, that's what national movements are like, but that doesn't stop us from dealing with them. And it doesn't stop us, we're like that too. All of these are simply excuses to try to evade the political settlement that has long been possible. That's a political settlement among national groups which exist. One of them has its national existence realized in the state of Israel. The other is under military occupation. If we agree, there's a point of principle here, of course, if we agree that Palestinians have the same human rights as Jews, maybe we don't, but if we agree to that, then there is an obvious form of political settlement, namely the two-state settlement of the sort that we have rejected, that Israel rejects, just as its governing party continues to claim Jordan. No, I don't think we should back that. I think we should allow a move towards political settlement. It won't be easy. There are a lot of problems, but at least we can begin to move in that direction.
Let me pick another question. And this one, Mr. Chomsky, we'll start with you. What do you think the U.S. can and should do to help stop drug trade in Latin America?
Well, one thing we can do to stop drug trade is to stop cooperating with it. So, for example, that won't end it. In fact, it will come nowhere near ending it, but it'll be a good start. So, for example, take, say, General Noriega. He's been well known to be up to his neck in the drug racket since certainly the early 70s, mid-70s at the latest. And he was a very favored U.S. ally until the mid-1980s, long after that. The reason was because he was performing services for us. He was offering a base for the attack against Nicaragua and so on. He ran a totally fraudulent election in 1984. This guy who was right at the top of the Colombian drug cartel. We rewarded that by sending George Shultz down to bless the occasion as a great step forward in democracy after the fraudulent election. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, but apparently because Noriega at some point stopped following our orders, we decided to turn against him, and incidentally we've achieved the magnificent result of organizing virtually most of Latin America and even the Catholic Church in Panama in favor of Noriega, who they hate because of the form of U.S. intervention. That's a real achievement. But one thing we could have done is to avoid that form of participation in the drug racket. The same is true of the Contra story. There's very little doubt by now, I mean, I think the evidence is very convincing, that the Contra aid program was tied up with drugs. It's not the first time, incidentally. You look at the history of clandestine warfare, and you find that it's very often linked to the drug racket. There's a very simple reason for that. Covert actions, clandestine actions, require untraceable money. And one of the places you go for untraceable money and for drugs and so on and so forth is to the drug racket. That's why the CIA back in the late 1940s, as part of its efforts to break up the French labor unions, reconstituted the Corsican Mafia, apparently offering as a quid pro quo the reconstitution, the rebuilding of the heroin racket. That's why one of the major centers of the drug trade shifted over to the Golden Triangle in Laos, Thailand, Burma, at the time of U.S. clandestine operations there. And that's why the Contra operations are involved in drugs. Now, this is a small part of it. That's not the whole main source of drugs is coming from elsewhere, but that's a part. So one thing we could do to try to control the drug racket is to stop supporting it. A second thing we can do, and this now becomes more serious, my own view, frankly, is that the only way the drug racket will be controlled is by legalizing it. That's a proposal that's been made repeatedly. I mean, I think we're in this has to be thought through carefully. It's not a trivial matter. But I think we're in a situation rather like that of prohibition structurally. The drugs are going to come. The drug racket is linked to powerful financial institutions. Ramon Millan Rodriguez, the accountant for the Colombian cartel, testified not long ago before Congress that he had connections with major American banks. He hardly needed his testimony to know this. I mean, this is a major capitalist institution. It's going to work. It's going to work through existing institutions. If it's illegal, it's also going to build up crime, organized crime and terror. Now, I don't think there's going to be, I really do not think there's going to be any way to control it. It's too closely interlinked with major centers of finance, capital, power, and so on. And I think the only thing we can do is to decriminalize it and try to reduce it in the manner in which the plague of alcoholism, which of course still exists, was decriminalized, thus reducing the power of the criminal elements while not eliminating alcohol. And I am pretty much convinced that that's the direction we're going to have to go if we want to overcome this plague, and it is a plague.
Mr. Perle, what can the United States do to stop the drug trade in Latin America?
Frankly, I'm not either expert or particularly interested in that question, so I won't say more than that I think the idea that we should legalize drugs, and we're not talking now about a little pot, we're talking about hard drugs, is on the theory that this will, that because it is so well protected by capitalist interests, if we legalize it, at least there won't be criminals involved, is an absurd notion. We may not be able to stop the flow from Latin America. We can, to some degree, reduce it, which keeps market prices high, and that may be the best we can hope to accomplish.
This next question, let's start with you, Mr. Perle. You point out that American foreign policy in regards to our NATO allies and Japan was based on the idea of reconstruction and not control. But you fail to take into account the sources of new materials for this reconstruction, namely third world countries, which were directly controlled by the U.S. How then can the United States foreign policy be classified as not being one of controlling other countries when this state of affairs exists?
Look, we have no particular interest, despite the fact that Professor Chomsky continues to assert it and obfuscates when pressed to explain himself, in controlling other countries. He makes it sound as though somehow we benefit from control, and take such an extreme view of it that we would even, in his theory, knowingly and deliberately drive a country that might otherwise not be aligned with the Soviet Union into the arms of the Soviet Union. It is a bizarre theory of American policy. The fact is that we have no particular interest in controlling countries beyond the United States. We have an interest in protecting our security. We do not want to see, obviously, Soviet military forces in Latin America. We have an interest in working together with our allies to try to protect and maintain a stable military balance. But the notion of control, his image of the post-war reconstruction of Europe, where we are accused of eliminating the anti-fascist resistance, and the buzzwords are starting to come out as this debate continues, in order to facilitate American investment. Now, of course, you would have most Europeans accusing us of protectionism and trying to protect our own domestic markets for ourselves. The fact is that we are better off, and it's Professor Chomsky's term, with liberal internationalism, that is, with other countries free and independent and democratic, in a position to interact on a free and independent and voluntary basis with the United States. And the notion that we have anything to gain from control is not only not proven historically, it's rubbish. It's a construct that he builds in order to explain, in order to get at what ultimately is his preference for a different international economic order and a different development model.
Mr. Cameron?
Let me stress again that my preferences are beside the point here. The preference of mine that's relevant in this case is permitting freedom and independence and avoiding forceful intervention of great powers in the interests of their own dominant groups. Now, the question was not reconstruction, but not control. Our policy towards Europe, there's enormous documentation on this now, I should say, was reconstruction with control. So we wanted to reconstruct Europe and Japan, but in a particular fashion. We wanted to reconstruct something like the old order, but now not hostile to us, rather integrated into the grand area. Remember, that's not my term, that's the State Department Council of Foreign Relations term that we were trying to develop. Hence, repeatedly, in country after country, we moved to undermine the anti-fascist resistance, which was largely animated by one or another idea of radical democracy or socialism or whatever. Sometimes this was done with extreme violence, as in, say, Greece and South Korea. Other times it was done by subversion, as, say, in France. Sometimes it was done by actual partition. The United States, one of the reasons why the United States was rather favorable to partition of Germany, and indeed may have initiated it, was that it was understood that a unified Germany would have a powerful labor movement. That's discussed carefully, I should say, in internal documents of the period, which have now been declassified. We wanted to reconstruct a particular form of social order in the industrial capitalist countries, one in which liberal internationalism would prevail, guaranteeing our dominance given the balance of power at the time. Mr. Perle points out that now we're moving towards a degree of protectionism. That's true, because the relative power no longer guarantees our dominance. And here again I suggest that we look at all of this in a broader historical perspective. It's been absolutely traditional for a couple hundred years since modern industrial capitalism developed. It's been traditional for those who believe they're going to win in the competition to be in favor of free trade. Now, there's even a standard name for this in the scholarly literature. It's called the imperialism of free trade, referring in particular to the British Empire. The British Empire, during the period when Britain was being established as as the world's major industrial power, the rape of India and so on, they were not at all in favor of free trade. By the early part of the 19th century, when England became the workplace of the world, the dominant industrial power, it became in favor of free trade on the assumption that its domestic investors and so on would win out in any competition. By about the 1920s, when England was no longer able to compete with Japan, it turned against free trade. In fact, closed off the empire to Japanese penetration. And that's exactly the story that we're reliving. As long as it was assumed that the United States' U.S. interests would effectively win out in any competition, as in fact they did for many decades, we were all in favor of freedom of trade. Now that it's not at all clear that they're going to win out in competition, we naturally turn to some other forms of protectionism, just as we were highly protectionist in the 19th century, when we had to develop our own industrial system by blocking British steel imports. Nothing very surprising about this. perfectly standard. If we didn't have the documentary record which explains it, we would know it anyhow just by looking at the historical record. With regard to the third world, that meant exactly what was stated. It's got to be available for exploitation for the reconstruction of industrial capitalism in the manner in which we want it reconstructed. That's part of the reason for the continual intervention and violence in the third world, the attacks on democracy.